can we all just admit it'd be kind of cool to see John Leguizamo come back as the Violator again? So before I get into the topic that this video is actually about, I just want to say this real quickly, that this is the first video that I'm recording since my Q&A celebrating 10,000 subscribers went up. I've had a few videos actually released since that went up, but that was because I had pre-recorded a couple things, which is something I'm trying to do more of in general, just because it makes my life easier if I'm able to do that. But the response to that Q&A was amazing and phenomenal, and you people rock. It makes me really happy of the subscriber base that I'm cultivating. So, you know, touchy-feely good stuff out of the way, let's get to Spawn, and more specifically what the latest word is on the film adaptation, well, second film adaptation of the 90s staple. So, I suppose a few things for context. I like Spawn. I actually like Spawn a lot. I think those comics, especially the first few years worth, hold up surprisingly well, especially compared to a lot of other stuff from the 90s. I really like the Spawn animated series. The Spawn film, it's kind of fun. I mean, I called out John Leguizamo in the intro for a reason. He's the best thing about it, but it's pretty dumb. But Todd McFarlane, the original creator of Spawn, has been trying to get a second film made for decades now. Now, despite that, he's always kind of talked up a similar general vibe, which is he wanted to do something much more as a horror movie. Now, way back, you know, years ago, he was saying it could still be a follow-up to the first one. That doesn't really seem to be the case too much anymore. And the thing is, he has been talking about this for so long. It's the sort of thing that, you know, he would bring up intermittently, and I would just kind of go, oh, okay, he's still talking about that, and assumed it would never happen. Well, a month or two back, he actually paired with Blumhouse Studios, and they have set a $10 million budget for him to do a new Spawn movie. And then he said something pretty recently, which I found intriguing. And what he said is he's basically gonna treat Spawn like the shark in Jaws. He's going to, you know, drive the plot. He's going to be, you know, ever present. He's going to be vital. He's not going to speak. And it's going to focus much more on, well, he didn't say specifically. He made the comparison that in Jaws you focus on the sheriff, Sheriff Brody. I hope people have seen Jaws. See Jaws. It's an amazing movie. But anyway, he makes that comparison, although he does not explicitly say who the film would center around. So I'm going to speculate a little bit about that and sort of talk about this as a general premise. Now, if this was the only adaptation of Spawn we had ever gotten, I would probably be a little bit annoyed by this, because it feels like it's not exploring a lot of what could be done with Spawn. But here's what I've always liked about the various adaptations of Spawn, is that they are all different from each other, and we've gotten a very action-heavy one with the movie. We got something pretty true to the original comics with the Spawn animated series. So, since I have that, I'm much more open to a new interpretation of Spawn on the big screen that is decidedly different. And actually, Todd McFarlane, he's a bit of an odd character. He's pulled some really douchey things in his day, but he's also somebody who I have a surprising amount of respect for, especially on the artistic front. That's not me saying he has the world's greatest artistic integrity, but I like his perception of a lot of things. And one thing I remember him saying a long time ago, like right around when the Spawn animated series and the movie had come out, and since they were such different takes, he said, you know, if I'm going to be involved in adapting this story, why would I want to do the same story again? I want to do it differently every time. Otherwise, where's the fun? And I've always admired that approach. So certainly doing a more horror-tinged Spawn himself as more of a creeping, malevolent force certainly fits with doing it as a different interpretation. And normally my gut instinct would be $10 million, even if you're like keeping him in the shadows, that seems really tight, but I'm actually fairly heartened by the fact that he's partnered with Blumhouse Studios. Now, Blumhouse Studios, if you don't know that name, they have been making a pretty solid name for themselves, backing small budget but well-produced horror films. They were the studio behind Split. They were the studio that backed Get Out. So the guy, Stephen Blum, has a really good eye for what has potential, and this studio seems to have a really good notion of where to allocate the assets of a tight budget so that they do produce things for, you know, $10–12 million range, which is really cheap by today's movie making standards, but make something that does not look cheap because they're really smart about where the money gets spent. You don't try and make something that normally would take $100 million on a $10 million budget. It just looks cheap. You have to plan from the ground up for the budget you have, which is another thing that Todd McFarlane has talked about. He talked about, you know, looking into locations really carefully to maximize the amount of money, because most of Spawn, even though it's a story set in Manhattan, it takes place in the alleys. You can shoot an alley anywhere. You can build an alley set for much cheaper than it would cost you to film on location in New York. And I just like where his headspace is at in terms of talking about things like, you know, if I save $100,000 on a location, that's $100,000 that can go towards an effect. That's $100,000 that can go towards a really good stunt gag. And I love the way this is being approached in terms of making the best possible $10 million Spawn movie that could possibly be made. If there's a hitch to this, it would primarily be the fact that Todd McFarlane he's writing it, which I'm fine with, but he's also supposed to direct, and he hasn't directed before. He's contributed usually animation related stuff to, say, music videos and whatnot, but he hasn't really directed live action before. So that makes me nervous. That being said, I don't know how hands-on of a producer Stephen Blum is, but, you know, Jordan Peele also hadn't made a movie before he did Get Out. Although I think what Jordan Peele had done probably lent him to being able to direct a movie a little bit more than what Todd McFarlane has done. But it being his first movie and knowing that it's a tightly controlled budget scenario actually gives me a little more confidence than, say, the fact that Simon Kinberg is directing his very first film and it's X-Men Dark Phoenix. You don't give a brand new director that much money because they don't know what to do with it. So that's a slight concern, but it's not as big a concern as it would be if this was a bigger production than it supposedly is. Now, I said I was going to speculate a little bit. The obvious assumption, if Todd McFarlane is making the comparison of the main character of Jaws being Sheriff Brody, would be to assume that the main character, or possibly characters, of Spawn, or at least the POV characters, would be Sam and Twitch. Now that is speculation. Man, I hope it's true though. I love Sam and Twitch. They are awesome characters. They play well off each other. They are a wonderful, just embracing but also slight spin on a pretty tried and true, you know, cop duo. They don't really break the mold in a lot of ways, but they just are a great distillation of that kind of buddy cop partnering situation. My main question about all of this going in is, if you're comparing Spawn to the Shark, that would effectively also make him the villain of the piece. And I'm not entirely sure what I think about that. I mean, I'm fine with, like, people, the cops, other people in the alley, whatever, being afraid of him. That works totally fine. But if he is effectively the villain, then I question a little bit more. And in terms of who else could be the villain, if they're keeping to a $10 million budget, there aren't a ton of options, because most of Spawn's really iconic villains are expensive to realize. I mean, the Violator being a big one. You could do the Clown again, but you know, I think John Leguizamo did honestly do it as good as it was going to be done in live action. And if he's not going to transform into the Violator, you know, why is he here? Other ones like Anti-Spawn and Angela and Tremor and, you know, all these are difficult to realize visually on any budget, especially on a $10 million budget. So I really do wonder, what I wonder is if it'll be something a little bit along the lines of the second season of the Spawn animated series, which brought things really down to the street level, and it dealt with way less fantastical stuff, and it had ordinary scummy crime people messing around in the alley. I suppose you could bring in Tony Twist, you know, as a mob boss who's getting wrapped up and tangled in all this. Although they may have to change that name, because Todd McFarlane got sued over that because he borrowed the nickname of a hockey player without permission. So if we get an equivalent to the character from the comic of Tony Twist, they might not be allowed to call him that, at least not without cutting a check. But overall, the more I find out about this, the more intrigued I just get. I really want to see what gets made out of this. And I mean, like I said, I think a lot of people just lump all of early Image comics together, you know, oh, Youngblood and Cyberforce and Brigade and Spawn, it's all crap. It's not. There's actually some good stuff from back in the day with Image. I think Spawn probably holds up the best of, I'd say, everything except the Max, which is really on its own little pedestal. So I'm curious. I'm tentatively excited even, which is weird for me, especially for something this early in production. I'm usually not that optimistic. Not to say that I expect things to suck, but I tend to have a very critical eye. My brain zeroes in on the way something can go wrong as opposed to the way something could go right. It's just kind of what happens, but I'm feeling oddly, I don't want to say positive, but I definitely want to find out more. Because so far, the more I find out, the more I'm like, okay. So those are my thoughts on the news we have so far about a new Spawn movie. What are your thoughts about any of this? Whatever they are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Do all the stuff, like and subscribe, and I'm on Twitter, I've got an email, I've got podcast links for all this stuff is down below. So until next time, this council's adjourned.